Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to our Fellows Public Talk series. I'm Claudia Rizzini, Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce Gabrielle Oliveira, our Maury Green Fellow. Educational ethnography requires a patient, fly-on-the-wall approach to research, especially when your subjects are young migrant children whose lives have been upended by political tension, climate catastrophes, or other traumatic events. Months of check-ins at school, at home, and in community spaces reveal the delicate networks of support that contribute to fostering an environment of successful learning. In 2018, Gabrielle began her ethnographic research on the educational strain felt by children in families who experience separation or detention at the US-Mexico border. At that time, she had no idea she would end up capturing the effects of a major global crisis in the process. The COVID-19 pandemic hit just as the migrant families in her study were beginning to stabilize, and as school moved to remote learning, critical supports dissolved, and new challenges arose. Gabrielle's research revealed the layered impact of these two converging traumas on educational and emotional challenges faced by Latinx immigrant students. While at Radcliffe, Gabrielle has been synthesizing the results of another ethnographic study that was similarly shaped by unforeseen global forces. From 2022 to 2024, she spent time in Brazil's schools studying Venezuelan migrant, Brazilian, and indigenous children, collecting data, stories, and interviews. What started as an exploration of multicultural literacy practices in diverse classrooms evolved into a powerful insight into how children displaced by the devastating impact of climate change in their home countries perceived the world around them. Gabrielle hopes that the book, stemming from this study, will inform teachers' training and pedagogies inside schools in Brazil, and that children's perception of climate change will continue to shape conversations in and out of the classroom. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Sarah Vaughan, Catherine Hampson Bessel Fellow at Radcliffe and Professor of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. And now please join me in welcoming Gabrielle Oliveira.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was a very nice introduction, and I'm always so amazed that you spend time reading all of our work, and it's so accurate in all that we're doing, and it sounds so much better when you say it, so I appreciate it so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today and for making the scheduling adjustment and coming on a Monday, a rainy Monday, of all things, so I really appreciate it. And thank you also to Radcliffe for all the support during this year and for all the work that goes into helping us prepare for each of these presentations. I also wanted to take a moment and thank my two research partners at Radcliffe, Nicole, who's from Brazil, and Alejandra, who's from Venezuela, who have helped and supported me all throughout this project. A quick disclaimer for the folks who are here, you're gonna see the slides and the presentation as they are. For the folks who are online, you're gonna see a different presentation with captions, and that's an effort out of an abundance of caution to protect the images of children that you're gonna see here. Although our team has had full consent and permission to do it, I'm always wary of releasing images of children into the internet. So bear with me as we make these changes. All right, so what happens when a 400,000 inhabitant city in the northern state of Roraima in Brazil becomes the host of thousands and thousands of Venezuelan families starting in 2018? Many things change, transform. However, for parents and children alike, public schools and the promise of an education become a beacon of hope, a source of support, but also a space of tensions and contradictions where children experience teaching and learning every day. While teachers try to care and include new students, challenges arise. teaching Portuguese, maintaining Spanish and indigenous languages, climate issues around deforestation and agricultural business, but also the devastating effects throughout Venezuela that have displaced people all affect the experiences of our youngest learners. One city grapples with the global movement of people, ideas, but above all, the city's educational system has to be quick and swift to adapt to new realities. This 2.5-year ethnographic project had the goal to understand how children, Venezuelan, Brazilian, and indigenous, co-construct learning inside elementary schools in the city of Boa Vista in Roraima. And also how educators undertake pedagogies of inclusion when listening closely to children. This is a book project that tells the stories from the point of view of students and educators as they engage with macro, socio, environmental, and economic contexts like migration and climate change. For this presentation, I will focus on a chapter entitled My Home, Our Planet, where I focus on how elementary-age children, 6 to 11, discussed and talked about climate change and immigration inside classrooms, cafeterias, playgrounds, and schools. I also focus on the ways teachers and school curriculum respond to children's inquietudes. I want to thank the folks in the mayor's office in Boa Vista for allowing me to do research in their schools. And none of this would have been possible without Professor Leila Baptaglin at the Federal University of Roraima and the students Flora, Yasmin, and Carolina, along with the students, teachers, and principals that allowed me in their schools and classrooms. As a Brazilian national, coming from a university based in the US, I know the privilege and the influence I had coming into my own country. From funding to what I look like, to flying in and out of Roraima, my presence brought both sentiments of opportunity and inequality. I am very happy to talk more about the collaboration between the teams and the methods of research in the Q&A. The context of Brazilian education matters for our understanding of how children's knowledge is produced inside schools. Specifically, the idea of interculturalism in the country. In Brazil, intercultural education emerged in the 1970s from the demands of organized ethnic groups, and it was strongly influenced by a tradition of popular education. In 1988, Brazil's new constitution recognized the cultural diversity of its society, which urged for an education reform. The Brazilian Ministry of Education has been the main responsible actor for overseeing and managing the struggles for inclusive education. The government has built targeted educational policies that focus on education for communities such as indigenous, quilombos, which has been defined by decree as communities of descendants of Afro-Brazilians with ancestry and land connection to movements of resistance to slavery and historical forms of oppression. This education offered in Quilombo's territory must be developed according to the specific culture and history of the community, so that's by decree. In addition to rural individuals with disabilities through Brazilian Sign Language for human rights, among others. Although Brazil has had a tradition of designing policies for intercultural indigenous education, which is known as Educação Escolar Indígena, intercultural policies for the education of immigrant or refugee children are scarce and underrepresented. For reference, Brazil currently has more than 8,000 quilombolas, 1.7 million indigenous people, and 1.7 million immigrants from out of a population of a little over 211 million. I then build a framework with concepts like decolonial childhood studies and environmental knowledges as they overlap with theories of migration and education. I home in a methodological approach that is grounded on a listening realignment exercise, where children's knowledges are centered and not forced onto an adult's gaze. Glockner and Alvarez, in their study of migrant children in Latin America, conceptualized children's protagonism as a situated and relational practice. It emerges through everyday collective actions and is shaped by networks of collaboration, interdependence, and reciprocal recognition within their immediate social environments. What happens when we follow the stories told by children in structured spaces like classrooms and schools? While in the social sciences, the notion of agency has been used with increased frequency in research with children, replacing traditional assumptions about young children's roles as mere recipients of adults' arrangements, there's still room for complex work that honors children's and youth's experiences. Thus, the concept of agency is helpful as both an educational aspiration as well as a signifier of a strong rights-based political commitment to countering the views of children as lacking capacity to understand, explain, and teach us about complex topics. Not only that, authors Abibi, Dar, and Lisa have argued that childhood studies represent a historically northern-centric and elite pattern of knowledge production that claims global legitimacy. The idea of the Global South further contributes to the hierarchical division of labor, where the role of the periphery is to supply data. At the same time, the idea of formal schooling and learning serve both an imaginary of modernization of a society and of individual liberation and agency. In following the ways in which children articulated a climate justice agenda across race, ethnicity, and nationality, educators can rethink what it means to authentically engage with children's knowledge production in schools. In environmental education, the goal is usually to develop pedagogies that are responsive to children's complex relations with the local environments, particularly with regards to possibilities of responding to issues of climate change. For example, children's relationship with water, emergence from embodied encounters with this watery place that children co-inhabit with human and more than human others. In the context of climate education, these conceptualizations invite a shift away from top-down pedagogical models that see children as future citizens who must be prepared for later responsibilities. Instead, sociological and anthropological work underscores children's capacity to engage meaningfully with environmental issues in the present. Researchers have documented how children demonstrate environmental awareness, express ethical concern, and mobilize around climate issues, often positioning themselves as moral agents and advocates in their communities. This is especially evident in youth climate movements, where children and adolescents articulate critiques of intergenerational injustice and call for immediate political action. So, I think with the intersections of these concepts to understand how migrant children and Brazilian children within classrooms co-construct knowledge and webs of solidarity. Somos todos Caimbé, tia. We're all Caimbé, auntie. Pedro, a Brazilian first grader, told me as we sat on the rug and read books for the literacy block that day. His teacher, Teacher Z, was keen on spreading books on a rug she brought from home and letting children have a moment of relaxation as they chose a book to read. When I asked him what he meant when he said, we're all Caimbé, he explained to me, pointing at a book which talked about trees, that the tree known in Roraima as Caimbé, but in Venezuela as chaparro, meaning short, could withstand anything that came at it: rain, fire, floods, mudslides. Rest assured that the Caimbé would still stand. The tree is known for its strength by having a layer between the bark and the trunk that protects it from fires. It is also used for medicinal properties in indigenous communities. We talked a little more about the Caimbé. Pedro mentioned that even though his city had experienced droughts that significantly lowered the levels of the Rio Branco, or the Branco River, as well as fires that made it hard to breathe, the Caimbé still survives. But if you have done any research alongside children, you know that they get to lead you to the topics of their interests. And if you're serious about listening to children, you follow. So Pedro quickly started to tell me about the Pokemon. And started telling me about Pokemon and proceeded to provide me with in-depth descriptions as to why the Metapod, this one here, a Pokemon character, could potentially live in a Caimbé tree, as it would provide a home or a stable environment. But Pedro reminded me that even the Metapod could not survive the amount of air pollution they were experiencing that month around their schools and their homes. Ele é forte, mas o ar está muito contaminado. He's strong, but the Metapod, but the air is very contaminated. As the image of this tree that exists all over Roraima, Pedro explained how he felt it represented their identity as people of the land. The intertwining aspect of children's conversations weaved in the fantastical, the real, and the everyday, while considering the effects of climate change where they live, but also the challenges that they face. So for reference, here's where Boa Vista is and where Roraima is located. The state shares borders with two other nations, Venezuela and Guyana, as well with the states of Amazonas and Pará. Roraima's vegetation includes dense rainforests, savannas, the lavrado, including trees like the caimbé and grasses. The river known as Rio Branco Basin is the main one in the state and covers a total of over 80% of the territory. The first colonizers that arrived in this area did so through this river. During the time of the conversation with Pedro in 2024, the state registered its second worst drought, the first one being in 2016, resulting from a lack of rain and increasing fires across the state, which resulted in high air pollution, per what Pedro described. Roraima used to be a territory under the military government in Brazil, and it was not until the Constitution of 1988 that it became a state with democratically elected governors. So this is a picture of the Rio Branco. This is an aerial shot of what Boa Vista looks like. It's originally the land of 13 indigenous peoples. You may be familiar with the Yanomami, Makushi, and Wapixana. The school system there has about 50,000 students enrolled in K through 5th grade, and around 14,000 are considered immigrant or refugee, and 10,000 from Venezuela. And this has been increasing. These have been data not updated in the last 4 months when they started the school year again, because there's enrollment that is happening every day of people crossing into Brazil, the frontier. So Roraima also has one of the lowest GDPs in the country, but it has a steady growth that is led by agricultural business primarily, and lots of government-sponsored projects. So big side of the government, still a big side of the military, as being a place also that is, an organization that is managing immigrants and refugees coming into Brazil is managed right now by the military. So my work has largely focused on the experiences of Brazilian children and Venezuelan children who migrated to Brazil in the first wave in 2018 and then in a second wave in 2023. So migrants primarily originated from the northern and central regions of Venezuela, with the majority residing in urban areas like Caracas, Maracay, Maracaibo, and Valencia. And this is just for you to have an idea of, this is currently the largest exodus in the world, with right now over 8 million people have left Venezuela. And you can see that Brazil is actually not the one that is the largest receptor, right? You have places like Colombia who are now with over 3 million refugees and immigrants from Venezuela coming into the country. But also important to mention that these are the numbers that are counted. We still haven't documented migration that are not reflected in these numbers, so you can expect them to be even larger than this one. And it's interesting also to think about that for Venezuela, you can kind of correspond the waves of migration close to when the oil prices tanked, right? So the first wave being in the 2017 and 2018, but what preceded that was this 2016 price of oil that tanked, and Venezuela is it's a country that has depended on oil for a very long time, thus that became a problem right later for that. And that also included the sanctions that the US did in Venezuela, which furthered the issues and the inequalities happening in the country in the first place. So this map also shows another climate aspect of the spaces that children are coming from and to. As you can see in orange, we see the lost forest. In the case of Roraima, the lost forest has to do with mining, which we call garimpo in Brazil. And despite the decrease in deforestation, which is the complete removal of vegetation, another type of environmental damage has increased in the Amazon, and that's caused by fire or selective logging. Due to the fires in Roraima, the area lost forest in the Amazon was the largest it had been in 15 years during the first 4 months of 2024. In the case of Venezuela, the lost forest has to do with the interplay of factors, including the Orinoco mining arc, illegal mining, agricultural expansion, and charcoal production due to national gas shortages. So for this chapter that I'm working on for this book, I think about these two pieces of argument. So children are often questioned as if they're coming up with their thoughts, ideas, and reflections on their own, or if what they say is a direct result of how they are socialized, what they hear at home, what they watch on TV or tablets. It is the play between structure and agency, but isn't that true for adults as well? However, a less common question is how children make sense, assemble, and communicate issues that matter for them. I've always been interested in the accumulation of small moments inside and outside classrooms where children unearth a topic, bring up a theme, and make a comment or question that disrupts what's acceptable or normed inside classrooms. So I put forward these two pieces of argument. One that looks at the child side, which is how children are co-constructing this climate justice agenda and knowledge transnationally across, and building these solidarity movements through the use of literacy, oral traditions, drawings, and critical thinking. But also on the side of the teachers. How are the teachers thinking about, instead of thinking about dynamics that I call pedagogies of silence, which means that educators are skipping, rerouting, ignoring, or shutting down knowledges that are brought forth, they're thinking about pedagogies of possibilities, which expands and builds on the knowledge that children are bringing in without letting out or without giving away numeracy and literacy and all the goals that schools have to begin with. So this 2.5-year ethnography has resulted in 500 hours of participant observation inside classrooms of 6 elementary schools in Boa Vista, interviews with family members, over 150 students observed, 22 teachers, 16 administrators, and 12 instances of researcher-led activities in classrooms over these 2.5 years. So for the remainder of our time, I'll talk about the 3 pieces of data that represent kind of what will be part of this particular chapter. Picture this. Every day of the week, children show up to school. First group at 7:45 a.m. through 11:45 a.m. And the second cohort, 1:30 p.m. through 5:30 p.m. So there's no full-time schooling in Brazil. So it's 2 groups, in the morning and in the afternoon. They wear uniforms and arrive at school with their caregivers being dropped off by foot, on the back of a motorcycle, a car, a bike, a bus. All wearing bright green t-shirts with the name of the school and the logo of the city and navy shorts. Each child gets 2 sets of uniforms containing about 3 t-shirts and 2 shorts, a short with a skirt if you're a girl, and a pair of pants. Each class period is about 40 minutes, and there is 1 teacher per classroom, plus an aide in case there is a child with special needs, which is required by law. Class sizes are about 30 to 40 at any given point. So it is a Tuesday morning in a first-grade classroom. Peter, a young 6-year-old Venezuelan migrant who had been in Brazil for 10 months, was sitting next to his Brazilian friend, André. Each in their desks, they pulled their chairs closer to one another. They were talking and drawing in each other's notebooks, pushing each other slightly and giggling. Their teacher, Miss Z, yelled from the front of the class, "Pay attention, please. How many times?" The 2 boys continued their chatter. Peter started. "Did you swim in the weekend?" André replied. "In what water?" "I don't know. Your water in your house," Peter says. Teacher Z says, "I will separate you 2 if I keep hearing this chatter." Peter replies to André, "Did you go in the water?" "I put my feet in the river, but my mom says sometimes it's not safe to swim." "Why not?" asks Peter. "Because of pollution. Didn't you have pollution in your home?" "There wasn't much water for bathing," Peter says. André replies, "Do you think everyone fits, todo mundo cabe, everyone fits in the river?" Peter says, "I go in the river, I'm not afraid." André replies, "I don't think it's safe. It's so big, there's enough water for all the families, and if the cats want to go in, they can," Peter says. André replies, "I don't know, we run out of water all the time, and having the river doesn't mean we have good water. The river is sometimes not good water. Someone said there was something floating there." Peter says, "It's water. Did you know the whole planet is water? Sometimes I miss my home because we could go to the beach, the real water." The teacher walks over to the lively duo. "What seems to be the issue here?" Peter says, "Nothing. It's because we want to swim in the water because it's so hot." The teacher says, "Again, we go with the water thing. Remember, we need to save water so we have it for the future." The curriculum offered by Brazilian standards in science and environmental conservation included topics like saving water, not littering, and watching for the effects of deforestation. However, water talk in the classroom happened. Peter and André made a plan together during recess, and according to them, they said that they were going to swim over the weekend. One of the most prized and proud spaces of the city of Boa Vista was indeed a water park where giant replicas of Amazonian animals splashed water in the extreme hot temperatures of the state. The water park faces Rio Branco, the most important source of water for residents in the state. So it's this juxtaposition of the types of water and the relationship that the state and children have with one another. The Rio Branco water is not always clean, according to the children. The teacher insists that we must save water for the future. And the water park opens from 3 to 10 p.m. Wednesday through Sunday, sprays water everywhere to entertain families and children. So picture this one. While waiting for the bell to ring and sitting on the outdoor court of the school, a group of children were playing. One girl was braiding another girl's hair, 2 boys played tag, and someone brought a ball. And others were just sitting, chatting, waiting for the time to go in their classrooms. I sit down with a group of children, and Marina, an indigenous Brazilian 10-year-old student, turns to me and shares, "Tia, auntie, did you know without water we cannot survive? The levels of the river are so low that a human without water cannot survive. That is something humans cannot be without, water." Immediately after Marina shared her thoughts, children jumped in to share their views as well. "It's not true. Humans can't be without food," said Carlos, a Brazilian student, to Marina. Marina fired back, "You're wrong, because humans can go without food for a very long time, but not water. Water is our essence." It coincided that I took a sip of my own water, which made the kids implode laughing. "See, this teacher can't even go 5 minutes without the water," teased Wesley, Venezuelan boy who had been in Brazil for over a year. José, Brazilian 11-year-old, continued, "Water is important, but if your water is dirty, what do? Do you drink dirty water or not drink water at all? Our water is dirty because people don't care. They throw trash, and the forests are burning, and the pollution." "Can I say something?" added Paola, a 9-year-old student from Venezuela. "Sometimes you have to know. Many people leave home because they don't have water and food. In my home, we had no light, meaning power, electricity, many times. So when people say they don't have it here, I think, well, I didn't have it before." Tony, another Venezuelan student, complimented. "I know what you're saying. It's when in our country we go days without light, and then sometimes water too. I remember my grandmother telling me she had to bathe me with candles." Marcos, a Brazilian 10-year-old, jumped in. "That's a fire. You catch on fire. We don't need more fires." Marina was not pleased with the detour her first sharing took and sat closer to me to continue our focused conversation. She brought in another friend, Camila. Camila was an 11-year-old, hard-to-hear student who felt very passionate about discussing water issues as well. Because I don't know sign language, I relied on Marina to translate what Camila was telling me. "Auntie, she's saying that where she grew up, they used to fish and the fish were good. Now she says her parents don't love the fish anymore." I asked Camila if she shared her parents' opinion about the fish. Was the fish not good anymore? She tells us that the problem is not the fish, but the water. It's the river, she says. We need it clean, and we need it full. Now picture this. In a second-grade classroom, children are copying sentences from the board that included the day's date and a question. The teacher asked the students to share something from nature that makes them feel good. O que a natureza te traz de bom? What does nature bring you that is good? Antonia, a Venezuelan girl that had been in Brazil for a little over 9 months, shared, "Did you know by 2050, there will be so many plastic things in the water that we won't be able to swim or drink, not even in the Rio Branco or the lakes," she said in Portuguese using some words in Spanish. The teacher, still holding her marker up in the air to start writing words on the board, responded, "Oh my gosh, why so worried? You are okay, everything will be okay. But we need to save energy, we need to save water. Remember this." Antonia continued, "Where I was, my country, we stopped having things we used to have, like we used to get food and light, meaning again, power and electricity, and then we came." Karina, a Brazilian student in the class, commented, "When things stop, the power, the water, food, you have violence. Did you see the people that were killed?" Karina proceeded to provide grueling details of bodies disappearing in the middle of the forest and stating that illegal mining was a dangerous activity. The teacher intervened again. Okay, let's stop at this very sad topic right now." Marisa, another Brazilian student, jumped in. "It's the garimpeiros, or the illegal miners. They are sometimes drunk people. They drink the alcohol, they get mad, they don't have anything. No one is rich. no one sometimes has land to live in. She takes a long pause and follows up with, I brought my new pencils today, look at them. The teacher again shushed the noise and loudness in the class. What from nature brings you joy? The birds, the water, the sand, the animals, children screamed in the class. So after a classroom observation to understand how teachers' literacy practices were impacting student learning, a 10-year-old named Gabrielle stopped me in the hallway. Chia, auntie, what are you doing with the camera? He asked. I explained to him that as part of our research, we were documenting the grounds of the school and the classrooms. I learned that Gabrielle was selected to paint the main school mural. He was staying after class was done to start painting a design he created on his own. I asked Gabrielle if he wanted to tell us a little bit more about why the mural was important to him. He stated, one of the things that worry me is how people treat one another. Just because the color of our skin is different doesn't mean we're better. That is why I want to be a lawyer. Many people go to jail because of what they look like, and lawyers can help them. That is what I want to do. Did you see how Vini Jr., a famous Brazilian soccer player, suffered racism in Europe? That is not okay. And what people don't realize is that we share one planet. Why would we all be here in the same planet if we didn't belong here? Why do people think they have right over more land than others? I quickly followed up with, I'd vote for you as my president. Gabriel didn't waver. He continued his explanation. People leave their country to come here because over there, they didn't have financial opportunities, for example. There was no power, no light, no tinha luz. So they come here because they need a place with water and light and food and jobs. It's all together. It's my home, but it's our planet. And who's responsible to protect our land? Another teacher showed up. I see you found our Mr. Mayor of the school. I shake my head yes, and Gabrielle continues. Many other kids also think that. It's not just me. We're more the same than we're not the same. We're all human beings. It's just that we, the students, sometimes we don't talk as much. This conversation, like other ones discussed here today, finished as an open-ended thought, one that needs to be cultivated, engaged with, and nurtured. Teachers focus on literacy practices to prepare for large-scale assessments and follow the rigid structure of Brazilian public curriculum. The time they had with children was already tight, 3 to 4 hours a day, including breaks and specials. Thus, what I call wiggle room, or moments to home in the knowledge produced by children and connect with their funds of knowledge, were smaller and smaller. Many teachers were caring and worried about children learning to read and write in Portuguese. I have written elsewhere that the focus on Portuguese instruction was often a form of care, especially for Venezuelan children. The discussion about climate, the environment, water, and justice often happen on the side. Often in Brazilian public schools, you'll still find teaching models that are rigid in their format. Children as young as 6 sitting in desks facing the teacher in the front who speaks for long periods of time, like I'm doing right now, giving children information. This model has long been critiqued in Brazil by Brazilian thinkers. Paulo Freire as being one of them. In the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire explained the banking model of education, where teachers deposit information and knowledge onto the children without much interaction or critical thinking. He advocated for a problem-solving education that fosters dialogue and critical engagement to empower learners to become active agents of change. This concept has been revolutionary in education everywhere in the world. Gloria Ladson-Billings in the United States has coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy, and later Paris and Elim with culturally sustaining pedagogy, which have both emphasized connecting students' cultural references and experiences to the curriculum and teaching. Indigenous education in Brazil and Quilombola education in Brazil are centered in this very premise, to home in the knowledges of communities that have been long marginalized and excluded from histories taught in school. Affirming identities and allowing for spaces where knowledge is co-created, discovered, and cultivated increases the student engagement, trust in educators, authentic participation of children in classrooms. This model can serve as a framework for inclusive pedagogies of possibilities that center the knowledge of children in their lessons and activities. In working with teachers to strengthen their pedagogies in a way that sees children and impacts their academic engagement and outcomes, many educators develop their own homegrown strategies to listen to what is students' minds. Teacher Jessica made a project with children about the different planets, where she coupled songs with facts about the size of the universe. Each child was a planet, and they discussed what the land looked like, water, and natural resources. Teacher Z focused on children's literature and brought her own books to show children the diversity in their ecosystems. Teacher Katarina had preschoolers try different fruit in her classroom and understand where they came from and where they grew, what kinds of vegetations were needed for them to survive. Teacher Edu discussed indigenous traditions at length, including relationship with the water and food, by recounting his own experiences of fishing in his community. Teacher Carmen used literacy material that centered on animals to strengthen spelling and vocabulary. However, the knowledges shared by children were transnational, complex, nuanced, and demanded a more critical engagement. How can curriculum on preservation and conservation also discuss issues that may feel closer to everyday experiences of children from Brazil and Venezuela together? Writing, drawing, and oral traditions present in Quilombola education and in indigenous education in both Venezuela and Brazil can help educators understand how to focus on children's funds of knowledge inside classrooms. So the distance between the curriculum taught in schools and the ways in which children are expressing themselves shows an opportunity for these pedagogies of possibilities. So here in this poster, what you see is this is a project that the teachers were leading, and then you can see that this is a presentation that students were doing. And these sentences mean caring is needed, right? Cuidar é preciso, or água é vida, preserve. Water is life, preserve, conserve, right? And then the reading in those two are also saying things that trash was thrown into the water, right? Without pinpointing who the actor is and who's taking on that particular action. So they had a political limit where statements were giving like the garbage is thrown into nature or rivers suffer with pollution, but not necessarily speaking about the actors involved in the workings. So in this particular example, what we see is we asked children to draw or to write what they thought, what kind of world they wanted to see in the future. And this is an example of a drawing where the student talked about during the winter how the river was full, and while during the summer there's a drought, right? And this is the preoccupation of the levels of the river. And that's not necessarily politically engaged in terms of what is happening and what it means for the everyday experiences. The world is knocking on our door, teacher Julia told me after we had this particular intervention. She explained that it was up to them, the educators, along with families and students, to build educational practices that were inclusive and powerful and focused on the new demographics they now have with issues that matter for children. In this example, too, we asked them to write what they thought potentially the causes were of what they were doing in terms of what is climate change or what it means, right, for the future. And you can see that some of the answers, there are more naming, right? So the miners are setting fire, or people throwing trash like plastic bags, soda cans, and food packaging. And then there's also the reflection on feeling that there's more rain and storms in one season versus what it used to be, and how hot the sun is. I'm almost there. By identifying the many instances when young children exercised agency or resisted the limits defined by adults in schools, as well as educators' avoidances and silences, we can change practices in schools and classrooms. Children showing their knowledge and resisting rigid processes, rigid spaces of education by critically engaging with topics like those of climate and the environment shouldn't be surprising. In addition, children engage in transborder or transnational thinking about what happens here and there also shouldn't be surprising. So where do we meet? That is, researchers, teachers, educators, leaders, administrators, politicians, students, and families. Data collected over these 2 years have supported the city of Boa Vista in making decisions about teacher training, social-emotional curriculum, children's literature, and pedagogies that engage with children's knowledges to build literacy, numeracy, and critical thinking. Instead of separating children's knowledge from the formal knowledge taught in school, educators increase trust, engagement, and show care when they take on children's articulations of climate justice. Our team has worked in partnership with the city to create and distribute children's literature, including books and curriculum, and to also provide training on inclusive pedagogies of possibilities for thousands of teachers every year. We have done exchanges between Cambridge and Boa Vista to explore how intercultural and multicultural classrooms work in real time, and we have structured bilingual programs in pilot schools in Brazil. The topic of climate, displacement, and the politics of illegal mining continue to permeate the everyday of young learners. The educators in leadership in Boa Vista are eager and hungry to make those changes, to understand the population they now serve. So as Pedro told us, we get to be like the Caimbé, but we must take care of our land, our home, and our planet. Thank you. Yes, you can. Yeah, these are acknowledgements.
Thank you. That was such an exciting talk, especially from a perspective of another anthropologist, where generation and childhood is usually the unspoken, taboo, not really talked about. So on that note, I wanted to start off with a basic question about methodologically, how do you do research with children? And think about that in relationship to your own thoughts on anthropological concepts.
Thank you. Sorry, I was like out of breath finishing there. That's like a lot, sitting there with the light, or standing there, I should say. I think a lot about, I think one of the things that I've been noticing a lot, even with my own students, my PhD students, sometimes they don't want to do research with children because they say it's too hard to get institutional review board approval, right, to do research with minors, and how do we do that? And then I think that contributes to furthering the gap of what we know. But I think one of the things that has been the most interesting, challenging, and the work that I try to do the most is to kind of break with the adult version of data that we're used to collecting, right? So I think when you hear children talking, you have to understand the arc of their stories in a way that won't have beginning, middle, and end in the way that we may expect, to have. So sometimes a lot of the data that I'll talk about, people will say, well, how's that climate change, justice, or how's that? And it is in my mind, it's their articulations of that. So I think that in doing research with children, first, the version of consent is different because there's a power struggle, right, that is forever there. You're still an adult, especially the age of the kids that I work with. They still like you, 6 to 11, then after you have to kind of earn them more, but 6 to 11, they want to be near you. There's still that piece that you're interesting. But I think it's staying true to their words as opposed to forcing what they're saying into an arc to make a point of an argument so that adults could understand it in a way that we perceive it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And so on that note as well, right, so this project's really interesting because you're thinking critically, again, about your data, who your subjects are, and more broadly in structuring this project as well, how do you think about these collaborations between North-South, post-colonial contexts of doing this kind of research around environment, climate?
So hard. I find it really hard, and this project that I did, with the folks at the University of Roraima, federal university in the north of Brazil, that doesn't get much attention, doesn't get funding, doesn't get, people that do research with Brazil will stay on a Rio, São Paulo kind of space, but it's so much harder to go and do work with, professors and undergrads and students who are in other places who, we deserve to know what they're working on. So I think the collaboration in many ways, I designed this research from the beginning with my co-investigator, Professor Leila Baptaglin, and it was always the knowledge, right, that folks in Brazil were generating that always took front row instead of, kind of how, because I was trained here in the US, right? So I think I had to really make an effort not to be imperialistic myself, right? In the ways that I understand research, that I put things together and really understand how research is being done without succumbing to this idea that the periphery is supplying the data for you to write on it and then gain the traction from it. So it was really, it's always been really tricky, but I think the way to do it is to be very open about the tensions of the global South and being open about the moment that we live and how my presence there brought both opportunity and inequality, right? How people had tried to do research there that maybe they couldn't, but if I show up with funding, with, the Harvard name or any US university, those things, they change. They change the space that you are. But I think the main piece was to stay really conscious and name it at every point of the design and the data collection.
Right, so when you got into the classroom, how did you decide in which students you would engage and how you would engage them, particularly Indigenous students? Obviously you have different Indigenous communities within these classrooms. So how did that play out?
Yes, so the way that we did it is we had a team in Brazil, so led by Professor Leila Baptagli, and she had undergraduates who were going to the schools every week for 2.5 years. So that was the big chunk of data, and we go to Brazil 3 to 4 times a year and do a more intensive observation, while I was there for the weeks that I was there for the 3-4 times a year. And in the classrooms, there's always the children that will want to talk to you. Mm-hmm. Much like when you do, a lot of what you read in books on qualitative research, I always say to my students too, it's the people that chose to talk to you. You don't read about the people that didn't talk to you, right? Or how you name that. So in a lot, there was like the children that gravitated, that wanted to share stories, that were close, that wanted to do it. But we also made a conscious effort to switch places that we were in the classroom so we could hear all the children, regardless if they were talkative or not. Yeah. And then what we started, for this particular chapter, the choice was made on these spontaneous, non-prompted moments that the piece on climate would come up, right? So only in one of the instances that I presented, we actually had a question, right, about climate, where we spelled out. Mm-hmm. All the other pieces were children discussing that. And with the indigenous children, the Brazilian indigenous children, they spoke Portuguese, so they would talk a little bit about their indigeneity at points, but there's also a population that I didn't talk about because it deserves its own whole presentation, is the Warao indigenous migrants from Venezuela going into Brazil, and sometimes they didn't speak Spanish, right? So then that was also the language piece, also needed more translation and that. But for this particular chapter, the focus was really when they were speaking about climate, and I didn't go in looking for it, the climate piece. I was looking into how they're learning together, how they're speaking Portuguese and Spanish and Warao, and what does that look like? How do you become, what's the literacy practice, how they're reading, and then the climate piece was really, really across, most of the children.
Right, so given how spontaneous your interlocutors were, these children, and bringing in these questions of climate and environment randomly, how do you then take that into account in terms of perhaps maybe some of the political topics or issues that might have been off the table, perhaps? Were there any, and how did you deal with that?
Definitely not so much for children. The issues were not off the table, but they were for the adults. So you could see that whenever, if there's something, especially with the garimpo or the mining, right? There was a lot of the teachers kind of rearranging of like, okay, let's not go there, right? Yeah. Let's stay in this one because we don't know what we're going to say. We don't know if it's going to become political. While I was there were elections, right? So there's a lot of, in one of the videos I didn't have in this one, but children are playing a game in Brazil that is very common where like you hit the card and it has to face up and that's how you win. And they were playing with little politicians' propaganda little cards, right? And they're playing with that, and I put the video up for a teacher training, and all the teachers in the audience were like, oh my, there's a politician. I was like, oh, they're just playing with that, but it means so much more to the adults than for the children. So it was interesting to see kind of this, what it meant for the children was not necessarily the same way that they were way more talkative about versus the adults.
Right, and I really liked your description during your talk about how the teachers themselves think about care and the relationship to language and the narratives that the students offer. So could you talk to us more about how care resonates in this project? And I know it resonates in your original research as well,
yes.
The first project. Is it a question around migration or education more broadly that care is really your locus of concern?
Yeah, definitely care is a huge theoretical and applied piece for me. I do argue that to migrate is to care, right? Like that's a big piece for me across all my research projects that, the way sometimes the media portray parents migrating as kind of, why would they put the kids in such danger? Why would they uproot? And that's the deepest form of caring, right? It's to take on that challenge. And I think what's interesting is that the teachers, for me, was a new piece of that caring part through language, where sometimes I could have read the data as, why are they imposing teaching of Portuguese, right? To why not also maintain Spanish? Why? But the argument is, I'm trying to set them up so they can't succeed, right, in the school. So I think it was really interesting to think through these frameworks of care, of what care means. Yeah. For a teacher and their responsibility that sometimes is kind of, it's within the school, because when the kids leave, they can't reach to care there. So it's kind of very in that space. But sometimes a lot of damage can also be made in the name of care, right? So that's also kind of the other side of it, that in the name of care, maybe you're not letting the kids talk about things that matter for them, because there's a lot of fear of teachers talking about, if you let kids talk about, if anybody has been in a young children's classroom, they talk about whatever they want to talk about, right? And you're just kind of like, oof, it's only 8 a.m. and we're deep into, the inequality in the world and the whole thing their own way. So teachers they also care about that feeling that I don't want to traumatize. I don't want to make you more scared. I don't want you to worry about the future. So as long as you're in my classroom, you're cared for, right? I have some control over.
Right. And so how did this project specifically come about? Was it, again, around the migration question, or was it also that you were seeing that the Brazilian state was thinking through their social policies in a different way, or in a way that was less productive, more productive than historically what you saw with migration?
No, that's a great question. I think when I used to be at Boston College before coming here, and then when I came to Harvard in 2021, there was finally funding to do work in Brazil. And I'm a Brazilian, migrant myself, and I've always wanted to be able to do work in Brazil. And what was always interesting for me about Brazil is that it has a nationalistic view on language and kind of an inwards looking, right? We border with a bunch of other countries that speak Spanish, but English is more, valuable according to folks to be taught in school versus Spanish. So I always thought about the porous borders around Brazil and what it meant for that country to exist in that, to sit in that space. And that was coupled with the big Venezuelan crisis of migration. So I immediately had my eyes on, a border town of Pacaraima, which is in Roraima, that borders with Santa Helena in Venezuela. And then I got in touch with the folks of Boa Vista, and I said, what does it look like right now, your classrooms? And they said 50% Venezuelan children. And I said, can I come? Because that's what we see, is that automatically when you have large flows of migration, public schools become completely overwhelmed very fast. But most governments think about public schools as curriculum and as education, and not as kind of sometimes the first site that a migrant parent is going to go for all the services, right? Yeah. So I was very interested in seeing what Brazil, with the history that it has, thinking about interculturalism in Brazil, but also thinking about the quilombos and the indigenous education in Brazil, and thinking, why have they thought about those models for immigrant and refugee children as well? But they had not, right? That felt really separate. So I was really interested in thinking with the history of the country.
That's really interesting. So, someone in the audience also has a question along these lines. So then thinking back global north, have you seen any kinds of examples of these social policies for migrant or multilingual students within the Massachusetts area or other northeastern cities related to trying to think about climate change and environment?
Yes, so my US-based projects are here in Massachusetts in about 4 or 5 different school districts. And there's a lot of immigration talk in the classrooms that was slightly different from Brazil. So a lot of talks about documentation, green cards, border arrest, detention, all of that by very young children, like as young as 5, from what I observe. But the climate change, what's interesting is the way that the children are talking about here, if I'm comparing, which I'm not a huge fan of, but if I'm comparing, if I must, it's not as embodied in terms of the water and the pollution and, as it is in this situated space in Brazil. Here, there's more of a concern, also an urban space here, right? More of a concern of the number of cars and the noise pollution, right? Like how busy things are and how there's not a lot of space to play and how there's not a lot of grass, right? So it's more connected with their quality of life in that way of play existence versus kind of this existential, we need water to survive, otherwise we're gonna die, right? Kind of this fatalist, although very positive and joyful. I hope that came across too. It's not, they're saying these things, but there's a lot of joy and play in that as well, so.
Yeah, and so, I mean, if you had to make a determinist claim, would you say it's one about poverty, or would you say it's something more intersectional? Like, what's going on that you think there's this difference between what's going on in the Northeast versus what
That's a good point. I don't know, I'd have to think more about it, but I think that's a good point to think about poverty as, a way, because it is like the districts that I'm doing a lot of this research, they are underfunded and, children are in overcrowded homes, and there is this sense of scarcity, right? Of things, and especially with the migrant population that I work with in Massachusetts, from Brazil, from Central America, from South America, there's this need to make it work, right? To earn money, to send money home. So there's this, this impetus to exist in this way. So I definitely think that's a great, point to think about in terms of inequality and poverty in that way.
And so, finally, I want to ask you, how do you bridge theory and methodology in research around education? Because it's so self-reflexive, right? It's not going out to a place where it's completely perhaps foreign in the traditional anthropological sense, but you do have some sense of your own practice, as you noted during your talk, about what it means to do research that is self-reflexive. So how do you bridge that gap in the field?
Yeah, and I think because I'm an anthropologist of education, there has to be the practice. The practice piece is always in my head, right? In terms of what am I doing that helps educators? What am I doing that helps and supports students? And so that's always in my mind. I think the issue could be to not let that determine the type of research that you do, because then you can be stuck in a cycle that feels very superficial, right? Like when we see in multicultural education, this kind of heroes and holidays type of education, right? So for 1 month, we're gonna talk about this, and then we never talk about it again, as opposed to this kind of like deep thinking about it. But at the same time, one teacher told me one day, and it stayed with me, she said, every time you do a presentation for educators, you have to have a Monday thought and a someday thought. The Monday thought, she said, Monday morning comes, I got 30 kids in front of me. What do I do? Like, what's the strategy, And the someday thought is, what do we aspire to do? Like, what do we want to do? What kind of education do we envision for the future if we have, So I think my methodology is always in this kind of present and future, towing the line in that way of the embodied aspects of that experience for children, but also thinking about what could this look like for the future.
Yeah. Well, this was really exciting.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much for this talk, Gabby.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also want to thank our audience for terrific questions, and I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs, and you can find our future programs at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thanks again for meeting with us today.
Thank you.